Good evening. Good evening and welcome very, very much to this segment of conversation where I'm very happy to welcome to the program Dr. Eric Hooglund. Dr. Hooglund is a senior archivist with the National, what is it here, the National Research Archive?
National Security Archive.
National Security Archive presently, and is an expert, having had time and experience and a continuing interest in Iran. And Dr. Hooglund, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you, Harold.
I wonder if at the outset here we might just briefly share, if you would, the National Security Archive. You've been involved here and you're bringing some information about under the Freedom of Information Act. But maybe just briefly what's involved here, and then let's talk about Iran a little bit. Could you share a little of the archive for us?
The National Security Archive is a new non-profit educational institution. It's privately funded with grants from major foundations. We will officially open our doors to the public in January of 1987. We're in the process of preparing a library for scholars to use. Our goal is to obtain government documents, unclassified and declassified documents, which relate to aspects of foreign policy and national security, and disseminate them to the public. What we do is work on, these are all contemporary documents, say within the last 5 years, and our object is to have a lot of documents available so that people who want to discuss and debate major issues of foreign policy and have an input in them can have the relevant documentation to refer to.
Marvelous. It's needed because it isn't always as effective. The National Archives aren't always effective as they might possibly be in that regard for the individual scholar or for individuals. It's important that be done, and you're able to utilize the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act to get some of those things.
Many of the documents which we obtain, we sue for them under the Freedom of Information Act, the 4-year act, which was passed by Congress in '66, to essentially, the objective of that act was to discourage the executive from classifying so much information and in effect denying the public access to information.
And you counter that trend and begin to open up and have a freer flow of information.
Yes, precisely.
That's something you're interested in. You're interested, thank you very much, you're interested in Iran goes back to, well, I think off camera we said that you had been involved back there in the 60s. You'd actually been in Iran for 5 years. Maybe you could share your own academic and personal background in Iran.
I first went to Iran as a Peace Corps volunteer in 1966 and spent there 2 years as a teacher in a small town in Azerbaijan, in northwest Azerbaijan, northwest Iran. After that experience, I went on to do graduate work at Johns Hopkins University and subsequently got a MA and PhD in Middle East Studies. And I did my academic research in Iran. I studied at the University of Tehran one summer. I subsequently did my dissertation research in villages on Iran, studying the impact of the land reform program. I had some postdoctoral research grants while I was teaching to do the follow-up studies on that issue. And then during the revolutionary year of '78-'79, I was a Fulbright lecturer at Shiraz University in southwest Iran.
My Lord. It must have been a great deal was going on.
It was a fascinating year to be there, yes.
Yeah. From that time, from the revolutionary years, you put it, from that time forward, then, have there been, the thrust of that, revolutions are difficult, revolutionary turmoil is difficult. Have there been major changes, sea changes that you've been able to perceive in terms of the Iranian experience since the revolutionary experience that might account for, to bring it up to the contemporary interest there is in Iran, of an alteration in the thinking of significant numbers of the Iranian leadership as to want to open a dialogue with the United States, or something as was indicated by Mr. McFarland's recent visit there and so forth? Maybe you could share something with your sense of knowledge of what in the world has been going on, and perhaps what were the precursor conditions that led up to the time Mr. McFarland came to Tehran. Kind of a large territory.
Yes. Well, the revolution in Iran has completely displaced the former political elite. And in its place is a new political elite which is drawn the top echelons exclusively from the religious seminaries. In other words, these are religious leaders who are clergymen who run Iran, and they do it in alliance with technocrats, lay politicians who share their religious commitment and religious values, although the lay people have obviously had secular educations, and they are people who are not, none of these people, whether we're talking about the clergymen or the lay individuals, were part of the pre-revolutionary political elite in any way. So you have a completely different political elite. It's similar, I suppose,
it was a thoroughgoing
to the revolution in China or Russia in 1917, or even the French Revolution, just a complete political destruction of the old political order and the people who ran things, and the substitution of the new one, although that doesn't necessarily mean there's a destruction of the old social, economic, or cultural order.
Interesting.
Although certainly on the cultural level, there have been major efforts by this new regime to impose a completely different culture, what they call an Islamic culture, as opposed to the secular and somewhat westernized culture which existed prior to that. This new political elite is determined to not have any interference from other countries. And within their worldview, the way they perceive the world, they perceive the United States as in the past having been both a political and a cultural threat. In their perception of the world, they see the United States as having been the main political sponsor of the old regime and keeping it in power, and but even more, they see it as a cultural threat because so many Iranians studied in the United States, and they see that these people who have studied in the United States, in their view, they see them as corrupt, having been
materialistically corrupt,
morally corrupt, and they bring back these what they view to be morally corrupt ideas to Iran, such as the type of clothing to wear, the consumption of alcohol, films which show nudity, pornography, and their whole view of the United States is a very one-dimensional view, which sees the United States as sort of the bastion in the world of moral corruption.
Moral corruption more so than geopolitical corruption, or the bombs and the hegemony, political hegemony. It's more the moral. Interesting.
Yeah, they. Remember, the elite are clergymen.
Yes, right.
And they were trained in seminaries.
At that, right?
That is always applied to them, but I would say that's inaccurate in the sense that they are not fundamentalists in the way we think of fundamentalists in Christianity, being people who are trying to get back to the fundamentals of the Bible. These people who run Iran are not interested in going back to the fundamentals of the Quran. In fact, they are interpreting the Quran to meet their interpreters. So they're not fundamentalists at all. They're innovators in a religious sense.
I see.
Although this is missed by all of the
I suppose we've seen women tending to go back to the veil and other kinds of things, and they've been called fundamentalists. They've been called a fundamentalist in Islamic. In what sense would it be called fundamentalist? In what sense would it be called fundamentalist then? Or is that term just complete? You wouldn't say the Iranian revolutionary.
I would call them culturally very conservative.
Okay.
But in religious and political terms, these are very radical individuals. Culturally, not.
Oh, that's interesting. Right.
Culturally, they're.
And they've been radical in political terms, in terms of the social economic structure of Iran.
To a degree, yes. In terms of the social and economic structure, there is a big division within this political elite between those who believe that the state is set up to take care of the community on earth and prepare that community for God. I mean, they all believe that. Prepare it for heaven, prepare it for the afterlife. a part of that elite believes the state's function is to be involved in the distribution and regulation of material wealth to benefit the entire community. And part of that elite would say that the state, that is not a proper sphere of the state only must take care of the spiritual needs, not the material needs of the society. So so the new elite doesn't have a consensus yet on what to do about especially economic issues. And there's a vigorous debate within that elite about what degree the state, in effect, state regulation of the economy versus total free enterprise.
Is there their attitude toward private property and the notion of private property, ownership of land? I heard you say land reform. Is land reform put at the individual level? Is it community level, or
that's again a debate. Those who believe in state regulation would say that concentration of wealth is religiously immoral, and therefore we shouldn't permit concentration of wealth. Wealth should be spread, and especially people should not own land, agricultural land, if they're not working it. And the people who actually do the farming should be the ones who have control of the agricultural land. And the other group, which is opposed to any kind of government regulation, would say private property is sacrosanct under Islam, and it cannot be interfered with in any way, and the accumulation of wealth is just shows you, it's maybe the old Puritan vision that you're proving God's work by what you do, and it's just a reward. And
you said before that it's conservative in the sense, in a moral sense, and that sort of thing. They have had dealings with, if only through the need to market oil and be in touch with the outside world and the broader world beyond Iran and so forth. And in that realm, have there been transformations within the normal commercial intercourse with the world and so forth, that a new leadership or a moderate leadership or some sort of there have been reports of continued communication, arms shipments, and the needs of normal commerce? Are they more, what is their view in terms of their relationship to the broader world on commercial terms and need to establish trade relationships and that sort of thing? And perhaps that would relate some to this transshipment of arms and so forth. But I'm just wondering what the attitude is at that level, geopolitical level.
Basically, one could make the argument that there's been virtually little change in that respect between the old regime and the new revolutionary one. There's one major exception, the relationship with the United States, which is political, economic, and everything.
It's a big change.
That is a big change. And whereas in the past the United States was one of Iran's major trade partners, both especially in terms of our selling products to Iran, imports from the United States. But with the exception of the United States, there has been little change. Japan is still the primary trading partner. West Germany, Japan, and Great Britain and Italy, and France to a degree, which were major trading partners before the revolution, have really substituted for the United States, and to a degree. There is slightly more trade with the Eastern Bloc than in the past, meaning the Soviet Union and its allies, but there was always trade between the Soviet Union and the allies. One of the only significant changes that I could see, Turkey, which is a neighbor of Iran, has become a major trade partner, and to a limited extent Pakistan. Now, under the old regime, very little trade existed between these two countries. There was a lot of export of oil, but Iran really didn't import many goods. So Turkey has sort of emerged as a major trading partner, but it still lags behind the primary ones, such as Japan and West Germany. So, but one could also make the argument Turkey's also a member of NATO, even though nominally it's an Islamic country, although it's a secular political system. So in trade terms, there has been little change. In political changes, geostrategic, if you want to get into that, Iran was a de facto ally of the United States. It wasn't an ally in the sense of a NATO ally. But there was there were a number of agreements. We had a military mission there. In Iran, under the Shah in the mid-70s, was the largest single purchaser of military equipment from the United States. That relationship has been totally severed. And to a degree, the role which the United States played under Nixon, Iran was supposed to be, the term used, a gendarme of the Persian Gulf. That role has somewhat ended, although although it has ended in the sense that Iran does not see itself as being the gendarme for the United States. I would argue that it hasn't ended in the sense that Iran still sees itself as the most important political power on the Persian Gulf, has a great interest in what goes on. And one of the factors in the present war between Iraq and Iran is their competition over who is going to have the most political, geostrategic, if you want to use that term, influence in the Persian Gulf region.
Yeah, I did want to ask you, what were the roots of that horrible war that's been going and raging so long, in which there's so much ignorance of here in the United States? How many tremendous numbers of people have been killed in that war, and what is the roots of that, and what is there such animosity between the two? It's hard to...
Yeah, well, one could go way back over the past early 20th century and see some roots. I mean, there's been a dispute throughout the 20th century between Iran and Iraq over their river boundary. It's called the Shatt al-Arab. It's where the river flows into the Persian Gulf. And basically, the Iraqi position, since Iraq got its independence from Britain in the 1930s, or it was British. It was a British position before that, was that the boundary was on the low water mark on the Iranian shore, because this river was the only access to the Iraqi port of Basra, which is up the river. The Iranian position since the 1930s has been that the boundary should be the middle of the river, as is customary in international law, the broad channel rather than on the Iranian shore. The Iranians also have their main ports on the river, and so in effect both parties have an interest in making sure that the boundary comes as far away from its own ports as possible.
That's what the war is about?
That's one of the origins of it. But I think it goes beyond that. When the revolution triumphed in Iran, they began to talk about that they were able to throw out the West, the imperialists. They had a great revolution, and they had this term export of revolution. And they began to call for exporting revolution to all these tyrannical regimes. One regime which they saw as being tyrannical was the one in Baghdad. Now, there are several reasons for that. Some of the journalists like to say it's because Khomeini was expelled by Saddam Hussein. That is not the reason at all, I would say. Khomeini resided in Iraq in exile from 1965 to 1978. That coincided with the rule of the Ba'ath Party, which came to power in '68. It coincided with a major secularizing campaign which had a tremendous traumatic effect on the Shia clergy of Iraq, who were the close friends of Khomeini. So Khomeini, as well as many other clergy, Arab Shia clergy, have had this bitter resentment against the Ba'ath for the policies which it implemented in Baghdad between 1968 and into the present. In 1980, and the Shia clergy basically saw itself as being under siege in Iraq. The revolution, the success of the revolution in Iran allowed the leaders in Iran to make a lot of propaganda against this regime in Baghdad, and in particular see themselves as supporting the Shia clergy.
Yeah. So there was a call for revolutionary transformation in states outside of Iran in the name of a rising Islam, and that was disturbing. And
I think Iraq saw that Iran was weak after the revolution, that it could be defeated very easily, and they used the excuse of this river I referred to early, saying that this was an agreement in 1975 which actually put the boundary in the middle of the river, Iraq maintained that this treaty had been imposed on Iraq under duress, and they were abrogating it, and they wanted the boundary to go back to the Iranian low mark, and this was the excuse they used for beginning hostilities.
Well, that was the source, the beginning of that war, and there's been this tension that's been created there, and that's been a reality certainly in that part of the world between Iraq and Iran. That war, the horrendous war, has been part of the reality within which they have had to contend and the people have had to contend. Now, as to the recent announcement here that Mr. McFarland and Mr. North and other people, 4 people have gone to Iran, I wonder if maybe you could make you know, what's going on? There would supposedly be, are there new political factions, the moderates, as they say? Do you give credence to Mr. Reagan's explanation of what's going on? Or how does it sit with you, the recent revelation of our sending arms there, and Mr. McFarland at a very high level? And maybe you could share us in, fill us in from your perception of it, of someone familiar with that part of the world, as most of us are not.
I would contend that the explanation that Reagan gave was probably fairly accurate. And when I say this, I'm saying that as coming from someone who has been perceived as being very critical of U.S. policy, and I still am in many parts of the world, including the Middle East. But I think the particular explanation he gave on Iran is probably fairly accurate for several reasons. I think that this administration has, on the one hand, it's perceived Iran as a destabilizing force, and has been very concerned about the role that Iran and the export of revolution can play in destabilizing the Persian Gulf region. On the other hand, there's also been elements within the administration, and some of the same people who see Iran as a destabilizing force, who also see Iran potentially as a stabilizing force, i.e. they see this Islam in Iran as somehow an ideological force which can contain the Soviet Union. I think there are people around in the Reagan administration who are still preoccupied with how to contain the Soviet Union, who really believe some of the rhetoric which has come out in the past about the Soviet Union being the evil empire and so forth. I think that there is this strain, although there are obviously other people in the administration who want to have more normal relations with Soviet
I would
Union.
say, it would seem to me, if we haven't had some sort of a broad geopolitical perspective for understanding the world from the days of George Kennan and the large enunciation of a policy of containment, one wonders what our policy on a broad perspective is. But I mean, I just thought I would say that.
I think when
one
there's...
looks for a broad vision, a geopolitical view of the world that would be in the same kind of vision that Mr. Kennedy or George Kennan used to give us and so forth.
I think when ideology defines that, it becomes very difficult to have a broad geopolitical. It's an ideological vision rather than
that
a
might be where it drifts.
strategic
But anyway,
one.
I didn't mean to. But anyway, in a sense, they see that as a major geopolitically important area of the world. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. So I think there are these two ways that the administration has always looked at Iran, and they're looking at ways of using Iran eventually to contain the Soviet Union, and they see Islam as one way of doing it. I think the administration has accepted that the revolution is there to stay, that these people are going to be hostile to the United States. It's going to be difficult to ever reestablish the relationship with Iran which existed under the Shah. On the other hand, there are people who have perceived Iran at some time in the future as being useful, and they feel that Iran probably has. They would argue, there are people in the administration who would argue that Iran has a greater fear of the Soviet Union than it has of the United States, and we can use it. And I think they really believe that.
You mean the people in the administration believe
some
that?
people in the administration.
You don't think there's a basis for that in an Iranian perspective?
I think that the Iranians fear, I think the Iranians are suspect of both the Soviet Union and the United States for different reasons, but they have a slogan, neither East nor West, and I think, which means to them neither the United States nor the Soviet Union.
Probably feel a bit beleaguered, or...
I think that the Iranians actually feel a little bit arrogant and cocky and think that they have this elite thinks that they have somehow proven to both the United States and Russia, if you bother us, we can have ways of hurting you.
And there's still a fanaticism, if that's the right word. People going off in waves of human waves off to the war, and there's a fanaticism? Or
they haven't used it. They used the human wave tactics in 1982 and again in 1984 for a couple of campaigns, but they haven't used the human wave tactics since
There's
then.
still strong support. I guess maybe what I was getting at is there's fervor. Revolutions are funny things. They have to deliver at some point and so forth, but there's still fervor and support for Khomeini. He is the undisputed leader of that country. When they speak, the administration speaks of moderate forces that they were trying to open liaison to. Who would Mr. McFarlane have been meeting with? What is the what are the internal political realities of those who constitute the leadership of Iran? And what would be some of the people that somebody like the United States representative at a high level, representing in a certain sense Satan, could be doing business with? It's a little bizarre seeming in a certain sense if we see things in the black and white terms that we tend to get from the normal interpretation of things with the administration and others. But maybe you could, what are the political realities of the leadership there?
I think that Iran has been sending subtle signals to the United States for several years that they're willing to have some kind of relationship on Iran's terms. And I think the administration, at least some people in the administration, have been picking it up since 1981. When that hostage crisis between Iran and the United States was concluded in January 81, part of the agreement, the Algiers Accord, Algeria mediated it, part of the agreement called for the establishment of a claims tribunal in The Hague and Iran agreed to put I think it was $3.5 million in escrow. And this tribunal would arbitrate claims between American private interest banks, primarily, but also a number of private companies who had claims against Iran for compensation for nationalized property and assets. That has been an operation since late 81, and it has been making judgments. Most of the judgments have been going against Iran and in favor of the American banks and companies. And Iran has been very diligent in paying off the claims.
Isn't it interesting? They've ascribed to and followed through on the dictate or the prescriptions of a structure of international law. It's interesting, yeah. They
so Iran has
better than we have.
Iran actually has paid over $2 billion to American interests, and much of it in the last 2 years. So some people in the administration are observing this and probably see that, Iran probably is more rhetoric, the anti-American rhetoric is there, and it's very strong, but they probably are reasonable and can be dealt with. And certainly the people who've been getting, some of these banks have been getting something like $340 million in the lump sums.
It's not a small amount.
So obviously these people were probably advising, well, you probably can deal with. And the Iranians also wanted to have some challenge to the United States. One thing to get arms. Now, one thing which the Iranians have insisted upon, which has not been resolved at the claims tribunal, the Iranian government said that they paid for spare parts for the military equipment in 1978. I think it was around $50 million in spare parts, which were actually being loaded on a ship on November 4th, 1979 to go to Iran.
Yes.
And they were embargoed by Carter because of the hostage crisis.
I see, yeah.
But these have never been sent to Iran, and so Iran has always claimed that these have to be shipped to them, that it's owed them, they're paid for, and they have to
They were offloaded in a warehouse somewhere?
Yeah, and they've been stored in a warehouse, I believe, in Virginia someplace.
Yeah.
I don't recall the details. So I think because of this, contacts began sometime. As far as we know, contacts began in 1985, initiated by McFarlane. These contacts were in Europe between intermediaries. and at some point it was decided to upgrade them, and McFarland went to Iran. We don't know exactly when, whether it was September 86 or June 86. Several dates have been suggested. But it seems reasonable to assume if someone of that high level was going to Iran as a emissary of Reagan,
yeah,
that he would have met with very high-level people in Iran. He was probably asked to come and invited, and they probably did meet for several days and talked about a lot of issues.
Who would he have been asked to come, or is there any point in even discussing that?
Once the story was leaked out of Beirut, and it got on the international wires, and the first person to confirm it was Rafsanjani, the Speaker of the Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Rafsanjani himself confirmed the story, although he downplayed it and said that he gave this bizarre tale of how someone who said they were McFarland came, and we don't know if it really was, and we detained him and kept him in prison, and he gave this bizarre tale. The fact that Rafsanjani himself would have been the person to confirm it seems to me to be a good indication that Rafsanjani was one of the people McFarland probably spoke with.
Or it might have been his invitation or something.
He was that McFarland probably talked to very high-level people. Now, some of these press reports have talked about the divisions in the clergy, and they speak of Rafsanjani and Montazeri as being divided. The fact that people who were close to Montazeri were responsible for leaking the story to the paper in Beirut and given a lot of detail, which made it necessary to respond, would indicate that Montazeri himself had a great deal of knowledge of what was going on, and probably Montazeri himself was involved in these discussions. I really don't see a great deal of what I would call dissension among the political elite in Iran over foreign policy, whether it's clandestine contacts with the United States. I think that they were pretty well discussed among all the main leaders, including probably Montazeri. And in fact, since the stories have surfaced about a rift between Montazeri and other members of the clergy, that high-ranking people, such as the President, the Prime Minister, the Speaker of the Parliament, and the Supreme Court Justice, have gone out of their way in Iran on all kinds of public occasions to laud almost obsequiously Montazeri, and how he's their chosen leader, and how much they respect and admire him. And Montazeri himself has spoken out publicly on the issue, saying, in effect, while condemning the United States on one hand, how it's the great Satan and so forth, very careful to say, well, our problem is not with the people of the United States, it's with the government of the United States. The people of the United States are good people. It is perfectly normal for Iran to have relations, humanitarian relations, with the people of the United States. The only thing impeding that is that the powers that be in the White House have a crazy policy, and they have to come to their senses, and as soon as they come to their senses, we can have a policy.
All of our leaders around the world probably say that even if it's an evil empire, the people are fine. All the leadership says that.
Yeah,
right?
If you look at it, it's kind of carefully worded to say, to give a message, one could say, that they're willing to continue the contacts. And if you really look at Reagan's speech, it's a message on his part to say, we're willing to continue these contacts too.
Yeah.
They're both sort of saying, we're very upset that this secret thing the cover got blown, and it's embarrassing, and we want to find some way of continuing them when we find the appropriate cover to do so.
The $50 million of transshipment of arms, and again, the immediate sense of the story now, that the upset on the part of people within the Congress in the United States, that there has been the sending of arms to Iran by the United States, against whom we were supposedly not dealing because they were terrorists and that sort of thing, that upsets the public consciousness and maybe leads to hearings. Those arms might have been, those sales might have been those that you said had been offloaded in Virginia or something of that sort. And I wonder, the obtaining of arms by Iran, has there been Western connections by Iran? How have they been getting their arms over the years to fight their revolution? What is the realities of that? Has the United States been involved over the years? Has Israel been involved as a surrogate or in some sort of special relationship with the United States as a transshipper of arms to Iran over these past years? And what is the reality that you understand it as far as how they've been getting arms and what the relationship has been between Iran and the arms makers and transshippers of the world?
Okay. If any arms were shipped directly from the United States with the approval of the U.S. government, and we don't know that yet for sure, that hasn't been confirmed or denied yet by the administration, but if any had been, I would suspect they were part of these spare parts which were purchased in 1977, 78, and were embargoed in 79. They've been paid for by Iran, and I suppose legally they belong to Iran. And
they shouldn't have had to have made a deal for that.
My speculation would be if anything came directly from the United States, it came from that.
Mm-hmm.
What is also likely, the United States may have told some of its own allies. Iran has a lot of American weaponry and needs American spare parts. It may have told its allies, such as Israel, that it would not oppose Israel providing spare parts, because we have agreements with various allies who get American-made weapons that they will not transfer American-made weapons to third parties without the permission of the United States. So the United States, it's likely that the United States provide that. In fact, reports in the press indicate that Israel had gotten those assurances and that Israel had provided. There are several types of reports, some saying Israel flew planes directly to Tehran, and planes came directly from Iran and picked up parts in Israel. Other reports saying that it was done through private merchants in Europe. Now, Iran has gotten a considerable quantity of weapons through these private arms dealers who operate in Europe in the so-called free market for arms sales.
And Israel has been involved in that relationship with Iran of having arms go to Iran, even though some would, Iran in its rhetoric sees Israel as an extension of the Great Devil.
That's right, that's right.
But there has been this arms connection that Israel's been involved in.
At least indirectly, and maybe even directly.
Okay.
Indirectly through the arms merchants.
Stop.
Get 2 minutes.
Oh, well.
Another source of weapons for Iran, recently, reports indicate China. China has provided, these would not be American weapons, it would be Soviet and Chinese-made ones. North Vietnam is believed to provide a great deal of weaponry. This would have been American weapons captured in 75 when we so ignominiously left South Vietnam. North Korea, we know, has provided a lot of weapons. Possibly they got weapons, although I don't think North Korea and North Vietnam have very good relations. I'm not up on that, but they may have got weapons via North Vietnam too.
So the realities of that are such that would give credence to the general viewpoint that Mr. Reagan has put forth, that he was trying to establish contact with the moderates and to establish a new relationship, an opening on Iran and something, and that rings in a certain sense true to you, and a lot of the upsets being manifest by people that were talking out of both sides of our mouth or trading in arms is not such a...
Yeah, I think that one of the aims that the Reagan administration has had was that Iran would be able to use its influence with these Lebanese groups in Lebanon which hold American hostages. Iran certainly used its influence for the release of the TWA airliner in July of 1985. That was released. And it probably used its influence with other groups. But Iran has been very consistent in the past several years saying hostages is not the way to conduct policy, and has been somewhat critical of that policy in general. Even though Iran is branded as a terrorist, it always denounces terrorist activities, mainly because itself is a victim of terrorism a lot, and so it's into Iran's best interest to join the bandwagon against terrorist acts, only because of its own
experience.
Yeah.
Well, Iran sees themselves as a victim of terrorism because they've suffered terrorism, and terrorism is a big word in the international lexicon.
Yes,
now it's hard to understand because one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, as you well know. it'd be important for us. Mr. Reagan's policy had been, we won't deal with nations that have terrorism. If you were broadly to conceive the notion of terrorism, it might be you could deal with there is activity that's going on that could be called terrorism in a certain way by nations all around the world and all parts of the world. That's an important thing, to try and get some handle on what we mean by terrorism and what is, do you understand? I mean, you've given thought to that, and is that an important perception in terms of all this? Or if we don't deal with terrorist nations, and how do we deal with this question of terrorism versus freedom fighters and that sort of, what do you think of when you think, with your experience in the Middle East, of the concept of terrorism as part of the geopolitical equivalent question?
Well, I think of terrorism as violent acts against unarmed civilians, and I don't distinguish between that violence, whether it's perpetuated by non-governmental groups or governmental groups. I think governments sometimes engage in terrorism as well as non-governmental groups, and I condemn both of it.
Was the bombing of Tripoli a terrorist act on the part of the United States?
I would call it a terrorist act.
Was the bombing of Lebanon a terrorist act? Was the bombing of... I mean, the terrorism isn't all on one side.
No.
One wonders in a large context whether the holding of an atomic Damoclean sword over the heads of all the people of the world isn't in a certain sense a terrorist act. But, I mean, terrorism is not so cut and dried as people might like to think in black and white terms. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to...
No, I would agree with that. The specific problem in the Middle East, in Lebanon in particular, we have this tragic civil war which has been going on.
Horrible. How many have died there? I mean, it's
at least 100,000 since 1975. You have you have no central government. You have these groups who have been the victims of violence and have turned to violence to counter-violence, and it's just created a self-perpetuating crisis. Some of these groups see other Lebanese as a problem, and some of them see other Lebanese and various foreigners, Israelis, Americans, French, other Europeans as their problem. And one group in particular sees the French and Americans as a problem, mainly stemming from what happened in Lebanon in 1982 and the intervention of the U.S. and France at that time as a peacekeeping force, and then getting involved not as a neutral party but on the side of one or more of the factions in Lebanon, and the factions on whose side they were not on became opposed to them. So these groups, such as the Islamic Jihad, who are doing the kidnapping, they have a very definite political agenda to try to get the United States and France to change its policies. They talk about the Middle East, but primarily in Lebanon. And one of the problems in dealing with this group is that both the United States and France have decided not to speak to them. So they speak to the enemies of the Islamic Jihad in Lebanon, which doesn't help resolve that problem. You have a great number of political groups in Lebanon, all with different agendas and mutually hostile to one another.
Well, the flap has been created recently in the announcement of that, but we have a situation where there probably very likely had been arms shipped to Iran sanctioned by the United States government, perhaps some of those arms that had been agreed to way back when, but they're arms. Israel's been involved in the shipment of arms to Iran. They may be trying to open up a new dialogue with Iran that could be transforming it from the black and white enemy kinds of terms that they've been seeing. Congress and certain people within the Congress are upset by the operations of the National Security Council bypassing constitutional process. Hearings are being called here in Washington by the intelligence committees of the Senate and the House to look at this question of what's been going on in terms of shooting from the hip syndrome of the president and so forth. The disinformation campaign was announced a few months back about Libya. There was upset about that. Nicaragua, there was upset about Mr. Hassanfus and that. Do you think these hearings that are calling to account in a certain sense that there will be anything coming seriously challenging, let's say, Mr. Reagan's foreign policy initiative, either from the standpoint of whether he is able to carry this out effectively, or if there's a problem of efficiency, or will there be any major changes that you see coming out of the hearings and their findings as we, and the national consciousness and perception as we begin to look ahead, or not? I just wonder if you have a sense of how you think things are going to be proceeding from this time forward in terms of our perception of our foreign policy stance. Mr. Schultz has been giving some signals, as they say, of disassociation with Mr. Reagan's policy, and I wonder how you sense things, since so much of it's been triggered by this Iranian situation.
I think a lot depends on what is the objective of, say, a majority of the members of both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees as they carry out these reports. If the objective is to somehow discredit the administration for what it's been doing with Iran, what it thinks it's been doing with Iran, that is sending these arms as a way of having Iran use its influence to get hostages, in other words, being a hostage for arms deal, and they see that as a weak, an Achilles heel that they can use against the administration, then I don't think that these hearings are going to be very valuable. If, on the other hand, it is approached from the point of view of there is not the accountability in making of foreign policy, that is, in essence, the President may use the National Security Council to make a whole range of foreign policy, such as dealing with the Contras, the disinformation campaign, all of these things which all of these types of policies which really conduct without any debate. And I would say in democracy, it's essential that you have debate on foreign policy as well as domestic policy if you're going to keep a long, viable democratic institution. If the focus is that the problem is that these policies are taken out without any mechanism for accountability. Sometimes you do have to have secret policies, but even secret policies have to be accountable, and that was a whole thrust of the investigations in the early 70s by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, that so many actions were taken out, which in the context of the United States would be criminal. And we were essentially sanctioning them.
Have there been criminal acts committed in these cases or not, or whether something that could be identified, just whether it's coming to a point of some major kind of transformation in the way things have been operated, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
It may not be fair to ask you this question, actually, but I mean, it's just
I wouldn't say necessarily that anything related to the negotiations which are alleged to have taken place between McFarlane and leaders in Iran were criminal. I would say a lot of stuff which has gone on with our Central American policy, especially in dealing with the Contras, is very borderline. That may be questioned as being criminal.
The disinformation?
The disinformation campaign would be criminal, yes. And maybe even the actions taken against Libya on very flimsy and non-existent evidence, in effect an act of war against another country is questionably criminal.
Yeah, there are these kind of things that will be, but as far as the situation, as far as Iran is concerned, were you heartened, let me ask you this, as somebody who's familiar with Iran, so were you heartened by the evidences of an opening possible dialogue between our country and Iran, as might have been evidenced by this, or are you optimistic about better relationships from the standpoint of United States, Iran, in a way that might be able to, well, to use a broadly worked term, serve the conditions of peace or the interests of the two nations? Or just generally, do you have a general sense of the relationship between them or the likely outcome of future patterns between the two countries?
Yeah, well, Iran is the most important power in the Persian Gulf region, regardless of what the nature of its government is. And it's inevitable that the United States, if it's going to continue to see itself as having interest in that area of the world, has got to have a relationship with that government. At probably will never be a relationship as existed prior to 1979, but it's going to be forced to have a relationship if it's going to hope to exercise any influence in that region, or to maintain its interests. I mean, one could talk about whether the interests are legitimate or not, but as long as the government perceives itself as having interest, it's got to have some kind of relationship with that regime. I think that the dialogue which was started probably was helpful. The fact that it was leaked and now it's public probably is going to harm. The unfortunate thing is that it got all this publicity, and it's going to harm a whole range of other relationships which the United States has, such as with various Arab states, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who will see the United States as having been duplicit. It will be perceived as Iraq, especially, which has gone out of its way to try to cultivate a relationship with the United States and reestablish diplomatic relations only a year ago. And in the sense that that it is perceived as going against the grain of the enunciated policy. I do not see Iran personally as a country which sponsors terrorism. I think that's a very unfortunate characterization of the country, but it's one which, at the highest levels of government, the President on down, has been put on Iran and is widely believed. And so now the United States is in the situation where it's being perceived by its allies as having these dealings with a country which is branded as terrorist. It is perceived as...
They have been vociferously anti-American.
Yes.
And anti-Israeli.
Yes.
And vocally and vociferously that.
Yes.
And so has Libya, particularly. Yes. So maybe that becomes partly the measure of what is given branded the term of...
Yes.
Terrorism is really somebody who's against American interests or something in a broad sense.
Yes, precisely. That's what's happened. The United States has gone of its way to try to prevent its allies from giving weapons to Iran, saying that Iran, while saying it wants to be neutral, Iran is the one who will not set peace negotiations. So if the United States has sent weapons, which it may have done, or which is even more likely, encouraged its allies such as Israel to send weapons, it's going to be perceived as being hypocritical, duplicit on this level. So the big problem has become is not for Iran-U.S. relations, which were very clandestine to begin with, but for U.S. relations with its allies, who put a lot of pressure on. As you remember, a lot of pressure was put on Italy a year ago because they didn't believe Italy was handling a hostage, the Achille Lauro hostage crisis. Well, a lot of pressure was put on Margaret Thatcher to have her cooperate in the bombing of Libya. And so the United States is being seen hypocritical by its allies who feel that they're putting their own relations in jeopardy to support the United States, which is not following the policies which it says publicly and I assume privately it has been following. So in that sense, it's more of a damage. Well, that could for be the United States with its other allies.
It could be a damaging sense of credibility for American foreign policy in that they cannot see a clearly enunciated, well acted out, meaningful foreign policy position on the part of the United States. It might be a question of the quality of the leadership as being a little bit not of the leadership quality that might be called for by and looked for by the allies. That might be just a general crisis of confidence, which also might come out in the Senate hearings, possibly it could expand out into foreign affairs and other kinds of aspects within the congressional oversight investigations, and it could have come out of all this. This situation makes it interesting time now as we begin to look ahead. I guess it always is, but things are changing rapidly and so forth. And from your, when was the have you been able to be back there yourself, or you maintain contacts, obviously? But have you? No,
I haven't been back since the summer of '79.
Well, it's an interesting series of events, and we started out, and you're now pursuing your interest in that area of the world. I'm happy to have been able to have you share with us your understanding of what's been going on, because it's a very confusing situation to a great number of us here. Do you see that the continued attention to that part of the world is part of a broader perspective of the whole of the Middle East that you think there might come out of this a more enlightened American policy, or do you have a notion of what is lacking in an overall view of American foreign policy position as far as the Middle East is concerned? Any overall critique? I mean, the relationship we have, is it overweening interest in association with Israel? Is there an overall critique of the American foreign policy in the Middle East that you can see, or just anything you'd like to add about a broad philosophical sense?
The United States has a major problem in the Middle East in the sense that it basically, since 1967, has not had a policy. It is implementing the policy of another foreign power, mainly Israel. And that means it has no overall global strategic interest. There were periods during the Kissinger, for a while under Kissinger and briefly under Carter, when it was trying to formulate its own independent policy. But the main problem is the unresolved grievances of the Palestinians, and those unresolved grievances are characterized as terrorism rather than legitimate political grievances which need to be addressed. And other grievances are developing in Lebanon among various factions in Lebanon which have grievances against the political system there, and those grievances again being characterized as just terrorism. In other words, it's just an unwillingness to agree to address the grievances of these people. And in fact, when they try to express their grievances in peaceful ways, they're repressed violently. And people who are repressed violently eventually take up violence. So you have this whole cycle of violence continuing.
And we have very few real allies in that part of the world. American perceived it's really, if there's some changes, the major changes, I mean, outside of Israel, I mean, there's a great deal of anti-American feeling throughout the area. This resulted from our own policy, and if there are changes to be made, that might be made in the perception of our leadership in the United States and our Congress and the people of the United States. We all might be able to understand the real truths of that area better than perhaps for whatever reason we have. And I'd like to think that your interview here might help in bringing a better understanding of what the truths are upon which a better foreign policy position might be able to be arrived at as far as that part of the world. I really would like to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, your rich knowledge of the area, and to remind you and the cable television audience, it's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions in of Dr. Eric Hooglund, right? Dr. Eric Hooglund, who is at the moment a research, assistant senior analyst at the National Security Archives. In Washington, D.C., and is an expert on, obviously, as you can see, on the realities of Iran, having had experience and written widely on it. Happy to be able to welcome you to the program, to his Perceptions, and I would like to invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week, but that's it for this particular segment. We'll see you next week, Mr. Hooglund. Dr. Hooglund, once again, thank you very much. Good night. We'll see you next week.